Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for it is and especially to my patrons and channel members, it is a pleasure having everyone who is here in the chat and everyone who is watching in the future. My guest for today is Jon Hammond. Welcome, Jon.
Hello. Thanks for having
And
me.
I'm sorry, what?
I said, thank you for having me.
Oh, you are most welcome. I wanted to begin with a bit of a funny story of what happened when I tried to read your book.
Oh,
And that is, I bought a copy on Kindle, and when I opened it, I thought, "Gee, this is odd." I thought there were supposed to be pictures, and
oh
it's
yeah.
just words, and I thought, "Okay, well, maybe this is just the introduction." So I read the first page, and it started with, God, meeting with Job, and Satan, and so I thought, "Okay, this is gonna be the wager between God and Satan," and it's talking about Job. And then it went into about how the Job asked God about why he had done these things, and God giving him the answer. And then he said, I then had an epiphany and realized that all of this was true, and I needed to turn my life over to Christ. I thought, do I have the right book?
I
And
don't
then I
think
thought,
so.
yeah, I know, I'm getting to that. And I thought, well, maybe this is the author telling of how he came to uh, be a Christian, and then he's going to get to where he started realizing that none of this was true. And so I started flipping through a few pages and went, "There's still no pictures. There's still just more writing.
Hmm.
Wait a minute, there's only 6 pages to this book. This isn't the right book." And then I got to the last page, and it was, "Here's how you can become a Christian."
Oh
And
my.
realized, even though I bought your book, but when I tried to open it, for some reason, it opened Don Byerly's Surprised by Faith. And I think the reason it did that is I have since tried to open it on my computer on Kindle, and it will not work. It keeps telling me that the internet isn't connected to the Kindle,
Oh,
and that
weird.
for some reason, that is the only book I can access from my Kindle.
Oh wow.
And I don't remember if I bought that to respond to something. I think someone referred to that book in a video I was responding to, or possibly my
Hmm.
husband bought that book. I don't know. He's a believer. Um, but it was really funny that I'm trying to find your book, and that's the only one I can get. I was able to pull your book up on my phone because my phone
Excellent.
Kindle app is working fine. It's just the Kindle app on my computer that's not working correctly.
Maybe it needs to be updated or something.
Well, it has something to do with the internet connection. It was telling me to go to
Hmm.
the page, tools and sound, and I did that, our network, and I did that. But when I did, then it asked me for the the password and the I don't know, it was asking me for things that I had no idea. Let's see. It said to go to tools, then options, and then network, and then it asked me for the HTTP proxy. And I have absolutely no idea what that is.
Oh
Um,
wow.
and then a username, and I thought, yeah, I don't know what that is either. So I was stuck with just my phone, and the book is really hard to read on a phone. I will,
Oh yeah. I
because it's not
imagine so.
designed for that kind of a medium.
Yeah. It wasn't. I did not have Kindle in mind when I started illustrating it at all, and
Hmm.
and yeah, the Hypatia Press, pushed to have me like format it for a Kindle version as well.
Hmm.
But they handled most of that other than me creating the PDF. So like I honestly have no idea why that's happening.
So yes, that was very funny that I opened that up, and that's what I got instead.
Yes, that's unexpected, and it's funny because the first couple of pages in my book are black, because it's all before the beginning, before there was light, there was darkness. Um, so at first I thought maybe like you were talking about the right book, but then it's like nope, that's not the right one.
Okay, so the book is called A Rising Star, or is that
The
right?
Falling Star.
Falling Star, thank you. Tell us a little bit about the book.
Okay, so The Falling Star is it's book one in a series that I'm doing that basically retells the biblical narrative from the Satan character's perspective. And
Okay.
it's all, it's a graphic novel, so it's all illustrated. And they take a while to make because my methods of illustration are, very time consuming. But
Mm,
so basically, it just kind of goes through the sort of most important moments in the Bible and um, tells it from the Satan character's perspective so that
mm-hmm,
we can see his, gradual progression. It's basically like an inverted hero's journey
mm-hmm,
where he's going the opposite way. He starts out as a very sympathetic, reactionary character, but like sort of the more philosophical questions about what omniscience would mean in relation to free will and whether he was created to be the adversary and sort of the existential crisis that causes in him is
mm-hmm,
sort of the impetus that gets him going on his character arc. So we can gradually over the course of the series have him take a much more active role
mm,
and not just be a reactionary character, but get progressively more nihilistic and well, violent and kind of don't give a shit.
mm, mm-hmm. How far through the Bible do you go with the book?
So book one covers up until the moment of the Red Sea crossing.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And now the one that I'm nearly done with the line art for book two,
Mm-hmm.
but there's still like 40 or 50 pages that still need to be colored before it's like ready to publish. Um, but this one is going to cover basically all of the books of the law. It's going to um, I'm trying to gesture with my hands and stay in frame. It goes from the Red Sea crossing to the Jordan River crossing because I feel like that makes a nice, little circle there
Mm-hmm.
thematically. But I'm a lot more comfortable with myself as a writer and an artist this time around.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
there are, moments where I'm fine with just kind of letting the pictures tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of people know the story already or can piece it together just from the illustrations as to like what we're looking at. But we still have sections that's very reactionary, but we also have a lot of character driven moments because we have a much larger cast this time. In volume two, I'm introducing other angelic characters that sort of form the core of his immediate followers.
Mm-hmm.
And I based all of their likenesses on other atheist YouTube content creators
Oh,
or
cool.
their digital avatars. Like Aaron Ra's in it, Apology is in it, Bionic Dance is in it, Sirius the Skeptic's in it, um, and yeah. So I got permission from everybody to utilize their likenesses and some of their dialogue. I've actually taken like quotable quotes um, from their content
Uh-huh.
to insert it into a place where it makes sense for the character to be saying that. Um, and yeah, either way, I'm just kind of putting it all together. So that will cover what would effectively be the better part of Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers, and end while Michael and Samael and the Fallen are like on Mount Nebo, and Moses has just died, and Michael's like, "No, you're not gonna. I know you have something dastardly planned, Samael. You're not doing it." And meanwhile, down in the valley, the Israelites are crossing the Jordan River with the Ark of the Covenant and getting ready to attack Jericho. And I feel like that, between addressing the law and kind of picking apart what's like logically wrong with it, what is like immoral about it, what is just kind of plain weird and out of nowhere about
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
in, certain specific laws, I mean. Um, so yeah, between the character development and the sort of unpacking of the lore and the world building and everything, um, I'm very very pleased with how book two is coming out.
Good. Good. Now, one thing that I got an impression of immediately was that this was kind of like Maleficent. The way Maleficent portrays her as the protagonist instead of Snow White. I,
I haven't seen
I'm sorry,
Maleficent.
not Snow White, Sleeping Beauty.
Right.
Is that kind of what you had in mind?
Not really.
Okay.
Or at least I don't really know. Like, I know of Maleficent, but I haven't actually seen the movie.
Ah, okay.
It's more of like trying to write a story that not only uses the biblical narrative as sort of set dressing, like a framing device, but
Mm-hmm.
it's the underlying thing is that it's not just an inverted hero's journey. Like, it's told in that style, in like this epic Greek tragedy type of way, but the whole thing is really allegory for the evolution of both God and Satan as concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So it has a lot of parallels throughout the story as to, character development is also standing in for evolution of the concept, because like in ancient Judaism, Satan had a function. He was like the prosecuting attorney,
Mm-hmm.
accusing man and calling them on their bullshit, so to speak. Um, and, his character evolves after, the Babylonian exile and a lot of influence from Persian Zoroastrianism, making it into more of a dichotomy, because originally, after El and Yah get fused together into a single deity, and there's all this stuff going on right before the exile, it's starting to solidify. Yahweh's taking on different attributes, but then, after the Persian influence, they separated. He's no longer, I create light and the darkness. Now he has an antagonist, an antithesis. And so this will be reflected in the story as subsequent volumes come out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your protagonist's name. You don't call him Lucifer, as I would have expected.
Yeah,
How did
no.
you pick the name?
Well, from Kabbalah, and, it's another way to render Samyaza. There's like there's a lot of different non necessarily canonical biblical reference material to draw from in terms of how I sort of pieced this character together.
Mm-hmm.
I drew from Enoch, except I kind of swapped the roles of Samyaza and Azazel, because I feel like it works better for the characters
Mm-hmm.
to have Azazel be the one that actually like has a family with a human woman when the deluge happens, and for Samael to think that humans are kind of dumb and icky.
Mm.
It just works better for their character development. So yeah, I drew from a lot of different sources and just kind of put him together. But yeah, I wouldn't go with Lucifer. That Dante did a lot to kind of cement that idea that these two characters were synonymous. And then, of course,
That
there's
what two
issues.
characters?
Lucifer and Samael,
Okay.
and Satan.
Okay.
So like, yeah, he contributed a lot to it being kind of cemented that they were one and the same. And also, there was a Lucifer of, all right, and it's like Caligari. I'm not sure how to pronounce this particular town's name, but either way, he was an archbishop and he argued with the establishment and stuff. And his name was Lucifer. So that might have, there was a correlation on the timing as to when he was a problem for the church and when the Latin Vulgate came out. So that may have, kind of influenced how that got in there too. Plus, it does make sense to translate Hallel to Luciferus when you're, doing your translation and all. But like, yeah, they are different characters.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I'm going. I'm leaning much more on the Old Testament for this.
Mm-hmm.
So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times I'll go with more sort of the Jewish interpretation on the literature, but then in certain key points, I have to sort of do what's expected from the more Christian perspective because I'm anticipating them being my, primary audience.
Mm.
So,
So
I
you
had,
think Christians would buy this book?
well, I know several who have.
Ah,
Um,
okay, very good.
and that's kind of who I'm writing it for, as well as the atheist community, because depending on where you're coming from, you're either going to see this as a good finally triumphing over evil kind of story, or an epic tragedy that is just heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
um I don't remember where I was going with that, though.
Well, I think there's a comment I've been waiting to get to for a bit, so
Oh, all
we'll
right.
we'll take that now, and that is Pink Evergarden says that Satan might have actually been the one with our best interests in mind. It
Ah.
doesn't sound like you've written it from that perspective.
Well, I've written him as a character who, he does have a degree of pride to him,
Mm-hmm.
because that's, an expected characteristic. But I also want to show, his capability. It's not like his pride is unwarranted. Um, we get to see his logic make sense, and we get to see him make logical assumptions based on inaccurate information that are wrong, so that, both of those can play out in real time in the story. But yeah, I am kind of doing a different thing with the character. He'll get there eventually, but like in book one, he's much more sympathetic. You kind of feel where he's coming from when, he feels sullied by his participation in tormenting Job, and has to like go spend some time in deep space kind of brooding about it.
Mm,
And then he looks at the wrist guard thingies and realizes they're like symbols of his slavery, essentially, and like tears them off, and realizes that it's, kind of been keeping his power in check.
mm,
That with they're like inhibitors, like without
mhm,
them he can actually do a lot of things that he didn't realize he could actually do.
mhm,
um
mhm,
and so we kind of show how his capability breeds a certain arrogance, because he actually is like intelligent and insightful and capable, and humans are kind of one of the first insults. Like, I have him already a little pissed at God for being sidelined during the war against the darkness, and being commanded to just play music, um, which of course becomes absolutely important because it turns out that Angel's song is the only weapon that can hurt the darkness, or really contain it.
Now, when you say the war against the darkness, is that the creation of light? Is that part of
Yes,
creation? Okay.
yes, it is. Basically,
I've never thought of creation as being a war.
yeah, it's an interesting take. I borrowed elements from a story from Islam, and um, some very, very apocryphal and or Gnostic works to um, sort of, there isn't much, but like the idea of this sort of battle against the forces of chaos at the beginning of time before
Mm,
creation could begin. There are, stories from different cultures, so I just kind of cherry picked a few instances and sort of put that together,
mhm,
to create a like pre-creation narrative that would sort of warrant, his initial disillusionment with God. But then, like, the real insult to injury is when they come back from the war. His act of disobedience is what allowed them to actually defeat the darkness. And, he's kind of expecting a hero's welcome, but then they get there and God's like, check it out, guys. I made humans. Your job now is to like watch over them. And Samael's like, wait, what the hell? Like, you made a bunch of monkeys out of dirt, dude. You made me out of fire. am I not way cooler than them? And yeah, and that it sort of parallels the Job scene where he's allowed to go to Earth and kind of mess with things. And from the Jewish perspective, that's not Satan in the garden in the serpent, but I did feel like I needed to play into that because it worked for the story.
Do you do the banishment of I can't even remember you don't call him Satan, you call him it's not Samuel, but that's the word, that's what
Yeah.
I always hear in my head when I look at the name. How do you pronounce the name?
Samael.
Okay. Does he get banished from heaven?
Not until the very end. This is going to be probably 5 volumes long.
Okay. Most Christians believe that he was banished even before the fall.
Right. But that can't be the case because he's very much welcome in heaven to have his weird little bet for Job's
Right.
life and family and possessions at the time that story takes place. So even if we put that, very close to the beginning of the timeline, it's still not before Adam and Eve.
Right. It never has worked. So is the Adam and Eve story in there?
Yes.
Okay. And does he mention anything about telling Adam and Eve the truth about what's going to happen if they eat the fruit?
Yes, he does.
Okay. So is he of the opinion that God lied to them?
Yes, he is.
Okay.
And we see that it's hinted at in his dialogue, but we, because of the narration, we also get his inner monologue. So it's not like he's trying to convince them of something that isn't true, that God lied. In his perception, God absolutely did. And he's going with that.
Now, one thing that has always struck me as kind of odd since I've no longer been a believer, although as a believer, this never even crossed my mind, is that after the fall, when God comes and punishes Adam and Eve, he gives them great punishments. But the only punishment for the serpent is that he's going to crawl on his belly, which serpents already do anyway. Possibly they had little legs and now they don't. But if the serpent and Satan were one and the same, which the Hebrews did not see it that way, but obviously Christians see it that way. Once Satan is no longer inhabiting the body of the serpent, Satan gets off scot-free.
Yeah, he's just going about his business. And really, it doesn't really look to me like he did anything wrong there. He encouraged them to make a choice, but and how is it even a choice anyway? Because you tell them don't eat this or you'll die, but they have no concept of death at all. They're not going to be able to conceptualize what he means by that. It looked like that doesn't even make sense to me.
Well, and it's worse than that. They also have no concept of right and wrong.
Exactly.
So disobedience to them is not wrong because they don't know what wrong is.
Yeah. So I do play into that quite a bit in those chapters. I kind of round out the first major section, right there when Adam and Eve are being banished. But yeah, Samael won't get banished until the end of book 5. The actual war in heaven I have take place at the same time as the crucifixion, because thematically that works really, really well, having it all build to this fever pitch, and the stakes are really, really high.
Does that have anything to do with why Jesus died on the cross, that everyone else was kind of too busy to take care of him?
I hadn't thought of that.
Okay, how about the flood? What's Satan's take on the flood?
That it seems a little weird to flood the entire planet and kill nearly all life on Earth just to get humans specifically, despite having the ability to target individuals and foreknowledge that it will not solve the problem it's trying to address.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the inciting incidents that gets him wondering if God is quite so omniscient as they have been told.
A question that I have often asked, yes, if God was well aware before he did it that this was going to be a colossal failure, which it clearly was, because Noah was sinning, just very shortly
Immediately.
after it happened. Yeah. And so were his sons, supposedly, although what they did, they really didn't do anything wrong, but God for some reason thought it was. And so why God didn't just get rid of them and just start over, or get rid of Earth entirely and start over? It makes no sense.
No, it is not exactly logically consistent if taken literally. But of course, that's what happens when
Mhm.
you're incorporating this culturally appropriated Sumerian myth that's been through several thousand years of the telephone game
Mhm.
into your holy work and spinning it as a morality tale. um it's bound to lose some internal cohesion,
Mm.
because we can trace versions of this story all the way back to Shurappak, um and the Sumerian kings list, and Gilgamesh and everything. It's kind of one of our first stories, because the event that it's based on, while much more localized and nowhere near as dramatic, um, that part did kind of sort of happen, and then cuneiform writing was invented a couple hundred years later. So naturally, it's sort of a fixed point on their timeline because it's fresh. They've been telling the story of the Great Deluge for a while, so it's one of the first things that gets written down, other than receipts for goats and grain and pottery and stuff.
Mhm. Mhm. Clement Green says there's a wonderful play called The Devil's Passion,
Hmm. Never heard of it.
and Justin Butcher is the playwright, and Perrault plays Beelzebub.
Hey, I should look into that.
Mhm. Michael Bell says, what I like about the flood story is it proves God is not omni and therefore not God. God admits that he made an error.
Right. I am bereaved that I made them.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
totally saw it coming because, I'm precognitive, but I'm still sad about it.
Yeah, yeah. And that Christians are able to reconcile that in some ways is not surprising, because whenever I have conversations with them about whether or not Adam really had free will in the choice to eat the apple or the fruit, whatever you want to call it, they cannot see that if God knew before Adam existed that if he made Adam, Adam would eat the fruit, that God's making Adam caused him to eat the fruit. He
He's
could not
certainly
choose
setting up the
otherwise.
conditions,
What'd you
you
say?
know, he's certainly setting up all of the exact conditions in which that can occur, and has foreknowledge that it will.
Right. And that's just it. That, if he knows before he makes Adam, if I make this man, he will do this. So as soon as he makes the man has no choice but to do what he has foreseen.
Yeah, basically.
And if God wants him to do something different, all he has to do is make a different man. Don't make Adam, make Steve instead.
There you go. Yeah, one that will do something else.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah,
Clement
wow.
Green
The
says, but
the
woman
free
was an
will thing.
afterthought.
What was?
But woman was an afterthought.
Oh yeah. Man needs a companion or a
I
helper.
like the version that says that woman was God's second try because he didn't get it right the first time.
There you go.
Okay. Okay, let's talk a little bit about your artwork. I am not one to appreciate art. My son tells me that, you know, whenever a new anime comes out, he'll tell me about it, and he knows I have absolutely no interest in it. And he says, "Mom, the whole problem is that you don't get the art." I said, "You're right. That is the one class that I really wish I would have taken in college was art appreciation because I don't get the art."
Ah,
Um, Tell us about your art.
well, I I basically I draw in pencil and then I trace over that with ink with pens, and then I do the coloring in Photoshop. Basically standard procedure for making comics.
Mhm,
Um, and it's very labor intensive because I'm hoping to adapt this to animation sometime in the
mhm,
future. And so I've done a lot of my backgrounds separately so I can reuse them, both in the comics and if I do get to adapt it to animation, because I would very much want it to still look like my illustrations. Um, that's another thing is I've progressed quite a bit as an artist since the last one came out,
mhm,
um, and so the this next volume is going to look significantly better. There's going to be a bit of a discrepancy there, especially because when I was doing volume one, my scanner broke halfway through the process. So I drew like half of that book with a mouse, um,
mm.
which
Wow.
was absurdly time consuming and really, really hard. Um,
Yeah.
but this time around, I get to use my regular process where all the lines are hand drawn, and it feels a lot more natural that way.
Mhm, mhm,
But it is very time consuming because I'll do backgrounds separately, each individual panel separately, except for like certain sequences where there's a lot of dialogue or something, and the level of detail isn't as important, so because it's a bunch of talking heads for a couple of pages,
mhm,
um, because I want it to not just be visually stunning, but also, you know, get to touch on, unpacking some of these more esoteric concepts,
mhm,
um, and allowing that to not only sort of do some of my character development for the different characters' arcs, but also introduce ideas, um, to the reader and sort of have some of my own commentary there, in terms of what I think on these topics. So the talky bits are important too. Um, but in terms of the visual style, it's not as important to have it quite so detailed for those sequences. So those ones I'll usually just do on one page,
mhm,
because it's very much essential to be able to know ahead of time about how much space I have for lettering. So for scenes that require a lot of dialogue, I have to, keep in mind like 30, maybe 40% of this entire panel is going to be taken up with either narration or word balloons. Um, Thankfully, this time around, there's a lot less narration. I'm more comfortable writing dialogue than I was. And it's not as necessary, at least until we get to the part where they're all at Mount Sinai and Moses is reading off the law. And I have several different characters having their own different emotional reactions to some of the things that are being said,
mm,
so that
mhm,
that can not only insert commentary but also do character development at the same time.
mhm. Clement's right, dialogue is tricky.
It is, or it can be. It
Mhm,
depends on the scene and what's happening in it. I find Samael's dialogue when he is um bouncing off one of the characters that's more antagonistic to him, like Mikhail, for example. They have a brief exchange at Sinai, and Samael is very flippant and cocky with him, because this is the first time, like, because at the end of book one, they get in a bit of a kerfuffle, which is just sort of a delaying tactic so the Israelites can get across the sea. But um, it's the moment where Samael makes the first flaming sword is in
Mm.
that fight sequence. So then when we see Michael again, and he comes down with the other archangels, and, you know, Moses has the tablets and all that's going down, and he's like, yo, I'm not going to let you interfere. And Michael draws a flaming sword, and Samael's like, oh, look, you learned a new trick. Yahweh must be so proud. Tell me, what devilishly handsome genius taught you how to do that? You know, so he gets to not only fan his own flame, but kind of, you know, just sort of be a dick to Michael, because those two don't get along.
Now, one thing that immediately came to mind when you mentioned the flaming sword and fighting between them was the passage in Daniel where the angel is delayed 21 days before he's able to come because he was fighting the and I this is the part I had to look up, but it's in Daniel 10, and he was fighting the Prince of Persia. Have you thought through that part, or you're not to Daniel yet?
No, Daniel will take place in book 4, and I have thought through quite a bit of it.
Mhm.
Especially the scene in the furnace, because that one is important to
Is
the
he is he
line.
the Prince of Persia, or is that somebody else?
No, that'd be Cyrus the Great.
Oh, okay. So the angel was actually fighting a human, not another angel.
Well, his forces, so to speak, you know, because at that point in the storyline, you know, Samael and his buddies and God and his host are kind of playing chess with human armies, and, you know, pitting them all against each other, and it's not really clear who is actually against who or what it's all supposed to accomplish. So, like, it's a way for me to not only, you know, deal with how the story really is presented in the Bible, but also, you know, take a step back from that and be like, okay, but like, look at the sheer disregard for human life displayed here,
Mhm.
in terms of, you know, neither God nor Samael's people give a shit about humans at this point in the storyline, or at least that's very much the impression that comes across.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, at the fall where Samuel disobeys, the Bible indicates that a third of the angels agree with him. Does that happen in your book also?
Not in book 1.
Okay.
It starts to happen in book 2. You know, he
Okay.
forms his core of like 5 other angels, and then toward the end of book 2, they're going to get Azazel out of the pit, to make an even 7. But and then they kind of go out from there, and like there's already hints that there's a bit of a Samael fan club, so to
Mhm.
speak, amongst the host, because when he's like, when so like they're at Sinai, Abdiel approaches him and is like, yo, I don't know if you remember me, and he's like, yeah, I totally remember you. You were, you know, my lead alto back in the war. You know, what's up, dude? And you know, they have this exchange. He's like, all right, I want you to go round up anybody you think would be sympathetic to our cause and meet me over that rocky outcropping in just a minute. I'm going to go taunt Mikhail for a minute. And so when he, you know, he taunts Mikhail, he tries to get a rise out of Raphael. He tries to talk to the angel of death, but he's busy. Ariel's having none of his shit in this moment because, well, all the untaught or untold destruction happening. And so when he gets back there to where Abdiel has rounded everybody up, there's like a bunch of them. And he's like, okay, no, actually, we're not going to have this conversation with an audience. And he picks out the ones who will become his lieutenants. And is like, no, I want to talk to you guys privately. And that's when they go to the summit of Mount Hermon and create their own covenant, so that happens in parallel with the, you know, Yahweh and the Israelites covenant and Samael and his friends covenant. And yeah, there's a lot of things that happen in tandem. with the biblical narrative to kind of, well, just see interesting parallels. By the time we get to book 3 and the Israelites are wanting a king, the fallen are going to have a democratic election, but Samael and Azrael, or Azazel, both want to be in charge. Either way, that'll play out in book 3.
Okay.
Because I've plotted the whole thing out ahead of time. So at this point, it's a question of illustrating and writing dialogue. The plot is already pretty hammered out at this point.
I'm trying to paste the link to the book in the chat. And unfortunately, the link that it's giving me is too long. And it won't. What'd you say?
I said, oh, that's annoying.
Yes, it is. It's very annoying. There we go. I finally got it. Okay, now it worked. Okay, so the link is now both in the description and it is pinned in the chat if you want to get a copy of the book. It is not expensive. I paid $3.83 for it. So everyone go buy a copy. Just seeing the artwork alone is well worth it. I don't want to give away too much of the story. So feel free to not answer this question or just, bait us on this question. But I'm really curious as to what the protagonist's overall goal is.
Well,
or maybe he doesn't have one.
It's very internal and multi-pronged.
Okay.
He really, really wants to believe in his own free will and will ignore or do mental gymnastics to explain things that fly contrary to that perception. We get to see confirmation bias play out in his characterization. He is very angry with his creator. He is trying to figure himself out and what his purpose is. Samael is a reflection of mankind as well. Both God and Satan are reflections of humanity. Yes, I don't want to give away too much. He's not initially planning a rebellion. At first, he just kind of wants to prove God wrong. But the more things play out, the more he, starts to think, well, I could have done it better. And the more followers he gains, we also get to see cult of personality play out. I'll put it like that. The more followers he gains, the more kind of disconnected he becomes in terms of sort of believing his own hype. And when he finally does crash into the throne room at the very end of the story, he's in for a very nasty surprise, because there's some things about omniscience and what a nonlinear perception of time would actually mean that he is not considering. And I think that humanity as a whole really hasn't pictured it in 4 dimensions in terms of what those real deep-seated implications are regarding free will. Because, forget about whether or not Adam has a choice. The real fundamental question at the heart of this story is, does God have a choice? If we accept the attributes of omniscience and omnipotence and ignore how those are very directly contradictory, let's actually explore what that would be like and what that means on the question of whether or not God has free will.
Okay, that sounds like a very interesting question.
Yeah, and that's what we're ultimately building to.
Okay.
Is that.
Okay. Now, is this your first book?
No, it is not.
Okay.
I published my first book in 2013, and that one is sort of a coming of age story about
Mm-hmm.
a young Native American boy whose father is killed on a hunt, and he, was about to sort of do this test of manhood thing where he went into the wilderness and, survived on his own. And, his father hasn't, finished teaching him all of his skill set yet. And
Mm-hmm.
now he's finding himself not having that role model anymore. So he goes on a journey and travels from what would be South Dakota out to like the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. And he encounters different characters from Native American folklore that sort of give him a helping hand, but don't really do anything for him. You know, like the original idea for this story, I was going to set it in a framework of Greek mythology, but there were so many, superhumans and demigods that I was afraid that they would kind of take over and sort of do a lot of the important stuff for him, and that didn't really work for what I wanted to do with the character. And then I read this book by Frank Herbert, my favorite novelist of all time, called Soul Catcher, and it just kind of clicked in my head that I should set it within Native American folklore, especially since like I actually know a thing or two about that. Not that I don't know a thing or two about Greek mythology for that matter, but like either way, it worked better for the story to have, characters like Coyote and the Thunderbird and Beaver and incorporate their existing legends into his narrative thread that sort of ties them all together.
Okay.
And yeah, it's about learning to grow up and do so even without a role model to show you how. And it also confronts death, but
Mm.
within the folkloric framework rather than, a sort of real world based way that could play out.
Is that also a graphic novel?
It's illustrated more in the style of a children's book, text to
Oh,
picture with like,
okay.
smaller illustrations in the margins. And that's
Mm-hmm.
called Journey Beyond the Setting Sun.
Okay. Okay. And then what was your second book?
My second book, I just called the Hamo Collection. It was basically a guided tour of my portfolio, some of my
There
works
was a
in
glitch in the
progress.
internet and your audio got garbled for a moment. So
Oh,
start again. What about that book?
the second book is basically a guided tour of my portfolio, so to
Oh,
speak.
okay.
I self-published that one. So it collects a lot of my like short comic strips about my kids and excerpts from other stories that I wrote. It has a bunch of just sort of my regular old art that don't tie into anything in particular, with sort of my reflections on it and like what I was thinking or learning at the time. And then it has like a black and white version of like the proto version of the falling star in it, because
Mhm.
initially I had intended to print it at 11 by 17 in like this widescreen format. So I drew it that way on like traditional comic paper at the time, and the story was considerably different. Like the bullet points are the same, but that was before I even realized that I needed to do it in the like uh first person. you know
Mhm.
at
Mhm.
that point their narration was all and then Samael, blah blah blah. And it wasn't until like I think 2014 and I went on the Left at the Valley radio show and heard my own voice like telling the story, because before I went on I put together this little video that basically like had the pictures and I just sort of read it. And
Mhm.
listening to the excerpt that they played, I realized, this would actually work way better if it's Samael talking in first person, if he's the narrator.
Mhm.
And it really changed not only the direction that I was taking the story, but well, just all of it. It just sort of rotated slightly and clicked into place. And it was like, oh, now I know what I have to do.
Mm. Have you read the Screw Tape Letters?
Uh, Not the whole thing.
Okay. Okay. Did you draw anything from, that is written from a demon's perspective, even though Lewis's perspective obviously is very different from yours?
Yes. And that was many, many years ago. I don't really remember it that well. I was
Mhm.
still in high school at the time.
Okay.
And yeah, I don't think I finished it. Um, it wasn't until, you know, later in my early 20s, and my oldest was on the way, and I was like, all right, I need to do something that's going to kind of demonstrate what I can do both as an author and as an illustrator,
Mhm.
that will, really make a mark and say something meaningful. And so I
Mhm.
better get to it because I'm going to be a dad here soon, and I need to start taking my life more seriously. um, I was like 20. I was 22. Yeah,
Mm.
Ella was born that September. So yeah, it was right before I turned 23. And yeah, I started, reading like the Bible, the book of Enoch, the book of Yasher, um, Paradise Lost, Dante's Inferno. I'm a Kevin Smith fan, so like I had watched Dogma, and that scene between Bartleby and Loki in the parking garage, with the whole "you sound like the morning star," and some of them don't even believe he exists. And that really got the wheels turning in my head. I saw the prophecy movies probably before I should have. And like this wonderful claymation called The Adventures of Mark Twain, like
Mm.
when I was really little. So like all these ideas have kind of been sprinkled in,
Mhm.
um, all growing up throughout my life. And when I'm looking back, I see all these different things that kind of contributed to me being like, okay, not only is Satan's version of the story a story that needs to be told, but I'm kind of the perfect person to do it because I can write it, I can bring the outsider's perspective to the lore, I can illustrate it, and use it as sort of this way to tell a very human story. If you want to go in and read it and view it from that perspective where it is, the evolution of a concept, and it's talking about it being a reflection of aspects of ourselves as human beings. um yeah, I'm trying to do a lot at once with this, suffice it to say.
Now, were you a Christian at one time?
No,
Oh,
no,
so
I
you
was not.
you have always been an atheist?
uh Sort of.
Yeah.
um I have always been a non-believer.
Okay.
um I, kind of brushed up against the idea. My grandmother was Catholic, and I went to mass with her one time and was like profoundly disturbed at the depiction of this dude nailed up, and was like,
Ah,
what
uh-huh,
the
uh-huh.
hell? And I was listening to what they were saying about the body of Christ and this is my blood and stuff, and I'm like, oh, this is weird. um but like,
I saw the best comic
yeah.
about that recently posted on Twitter. It was someone offers someone a glass of wine and says, "Here's the blood of Christ," and then offers him a wafer and says, "The body of Christ," and he says, "Uh, cannibalism?" And he says, "You need more blood."
Blood.
Yeah.
Right.
You need to be drunk on the wine before this makes sense.
Right. Yeah, so I brushed up against it. It's hard to not know of Christianity just because it's such a integral part of the cultural zeitgeist, in this country, and kind of, you know I've definitely brushed up against it, but I didn't really care
Mhm,
for a
mhm.
good while there. I read parts of it, when I was 13 and watched Pulp Fiction. I went ahead and looked up Ezekiel 25:17 and found out it was very different, not quite the Tarantino version, but still interesting.
Mhm.
But yeah, I didn't really start immersing myself in the lore until, I was wanting to essentially become an expert on it so I could really, really do this story justice.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
and that's when, I started, I did YouTube videos for a little while, where I'm just kind of reading through or summarizing parts of the Bible and, having my own kind of comedic license with some of the dialogue. And that was pretty fun. But like, it was sort of that process that made me realize, oh, there's a word for people like me that don't believe this actually happened. And like, the more I learned about it, the more I came up against, instances of stuff that absolutely could not possibly be true.
Mhm.
Um, like the sky or the sun stopping in the sky in Joshua, or the,
Mhm.
shadows moving backward for Hezekiah. I understand centripetal force and orbital velocity and things like this. So I'm like, wait a minute, that would have really catastrophic consequences. Um, so yeah, it was sort of the process of learning the lore really well for my book that helped me like really realize that I definitely didn't believe this was real.
Mhm.
Um, and because I had already realized that I thought God was probably not a thing,
Mhm.
but that it didn't really matter a whole lot, in the grand scheme of things, because one way or the other, I was pretty much on my own to figure things out and make stuff happen. Um, so I just kind of went from there. And yeah, the more I brushed up against the lore, the more sure I was, okay, this definitely didn't happen. This is very different from, how this actually played out in history, you know, da 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 da. And that's when I started, actually watching atheist YouTube content, because like I was putting my stuff out there, and I
Mhm.
found that I started watching, like Dark Matter and Apologia, and it's like, okay, so there's like a whole community of people who think like I do. This is cool. Um, and that was kind of a game changer, because that by default made me brush up against creationism and
Mm.
the Institute for Creation Research and Answers in Genesis. And that's when I started realizing sort of the moral imperative here, because organizations like that are doing actual, literal, measurable harm to scientific literacy for profit,
Mhm.
so that they
Mhm.
can make themselves into these quasi-religious figures and literally fleece people. And I mean, to me, that absolutely crosses the line between religious freedom and snake oil salesman, just like straight up exploitation. And it has far reaching consequences. And so that's when I started taking it more seriously. And I didn't have the time to be, a husband and father and do YouTube and do my book. So I was like, okay, I'm putting all my eggs in one basket, I guess.
Mhm.
Um,
That makes sense.
so I'm like, okay, I'm gonna raise my family, and I'm gonna make this, series of graphic novels that are not only going to unpack the theology, but really explain what's wrong with it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Unpack how certain things are just flat out physically impossible, or logically inconsistent,
Mhm.
or any of these things, so that it can be used as a primer and sort of a tool for deconversion, but you don't really realize it, because it comes off at first as entertainment that's like loaded with Easter eggs. You know,
Mm. Mhm.
once I have more readers, I'm sure there's going to be a couple of Assyriologists in the background going like, yeah, when they like notice that my, Assyrian armor is historically accurate,
Have
and,
you met
little things like that.
Dr. Josh Bowen?
We've had a couple of back and forths.
Okay. Okay.
Like I
He
had
is an
book
Assyriologist.
in, e- exactly why I used that example. Yeah, I have a copy of his book right here,
Ah,
and
okay.
yeah, we know of each other. We haven't
Okay.
had a whole lot of interactions, but yeah, he's a cool guy.
Mhm. Clement Green asks, is it a, I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly, hokusai in the
Oh,
background?
Hokusai. Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, I carefully arranged the background to reflect a lot of different influences
Mhm.
on my life, my personality, and my work. So we have Hokusai, we have my family drawn as Garfield characters that I
Oh,
drew,
cool.
my son Asher's paintings up here, you know, Da Vinci, 300, Watchmen, Dune, Nagamati, the books of Enoch, Sherlock Holmes, Paradise Lost. Like a lot of the influences are there. I even managed to get the Enterprise into the frame.
Okay. We are out of time.
Ah,
So,
yep,
yeah.
that went by.
um, is there anything else that you'd like to say in closing?
Oh, just I highly recommend checking it out. We have a Facebook page, and like I said, I'm nearing completion on volume 2, and I'm trying to do something really, really special with this. That well, it has people talking about it, like
Okay.
hopefully long after I'm gone. It's sort of like Gilgamesh. They're my walls of Uruk. It's like my magnum opus.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, so if yeah, a falling star, the falling star is available on Amazon, and there's a link both in the description and pinned in the chat. Yeah, go check it out. It is not expensive, and it is well worth it. I have coming up next week, following my show at 5 p.m. Central, Art Against Ignorance is launching a new channel called the Utopians.
Oh wow.
And it's a group of people, and I'm going to be hosting the show. We're going to kick off by just discussing what is our idea of utopia, what we'd like to see happen in this world. And so we're just going to start with a discussion of what would a utopian world look like for our first show.
Hey,
And my show next week, I have Kip Davis coming.
nice.
Yeah, yeah. And if anyone doesn't know Kip Davis, he is an expert in Hebrew, in the ancient Hebrew scriptures, and we're going to talk about what is it now. There's going to be a lot of speculation on this point because it was how would people in the time when Genesis was written likely have seen these verses to what this was to mean.
Oh,
Did
that should
did
be a
they take
fascinating
it
discussion.
literally? Yeah, did they think that these things literally happened, or, how was this received when it was first
Right.
written? Mhm.
Wow. Well, I'm definitely gonna want to tune into that. That sounds awesome.
Okay, I will be happy to see you in the chat, and Kip Davis will be there to answer any questions.
Fantastic.
So, thank you for coming, John. It's been a pleasure having you,
Hey, thanks for having me.
and thank you to everyone in the chat and watching in the future. Live your life.